Season 4 of Notebook on Cities and Culture is brought to you by Daniel Murphy, Polar Inertia, a journal of nomadic and popular culture online at polarinertia.com, and Medivate, a community and set of tools to help you build the kind of meditation practice you'd like to have, online at medivate.com. You've been writing about food here in Los Angeles for over a year, and you've written a lot in that time, but I think I've had no more conversations about a piece of yours in that span of time than about the piece on the Bloomin' Onion at the Outback Steakhouse. What would possess you to write about the Bloomin' Onion?
It was something, I'm an Australian, and so it was something that I felt like I wanted to overcome. I am very strangely resentful of the way that people view Australians in America, mainly because I came here at a kind of difficult age to transition culturally. I was 14, and I was I thought I was really punk rock, and everybody just wanted to talk to me about kangaroos, and so ever since then I've kind of resented that.
Was this just after the Australian fads of the 80s?
It was 1991, so yes.
It was just after.
Yes, right then, yes. And I blame Paul Hogan for all of my problems in life.
Did friends ask if you wanted to go to Koala Blue?
They asked every conceivable thing like that you could think of.
You didn't want to go to Koala Blue, I take it.
I didn't. I've always been kind of resentful of and also interested in that American perception of Australia, and obviously Outback Steakhouse is a real symbol of that, especially because it's specifically not Australian, and people don't know that. I mean, the people who started it really tried very hard to... They didn't even go visit Australia on purpose for holidays so that they wouldn't be influenced by...
My favorite detail you included, they specifically didn't go to make their Australian restaurant.
They wanted it to be... not even the Disney version. I mean, you go to Epcot Center and there are some things about the cultures of those countries that come through. So there was that. I also... I've written a lot of the stories that I've written in my life that I really like and I'm proud of are not about high-end food, and they're not even about that kind of like cult foodie thing of, ethnic, for lack of a better word, food. Because as much as I love that, I don't think that there are as many people kind of spending their whole lives driving 45 minutes to get to some ramen shack as you might think. There is certainly those people. I'm one of those people, but, there are many more people who eat in chain restaurants than that. And so I wrote a story a couple years ago about Waffle House that I really loved writing, loved doing the reporting on. It got a really big response. And I just think that kind of the food that America actually eats is not covered very much by food media, except to kind of tut at it for being unhealthy and not cool and whatever. And so I kind of, for me, I wanted to look at why do people like this kind of food? What about it? Especially when Outback in particular is so unhealthy and has this reputation for being so unhealthy, kind of to look at it from a different viewpoint, from a critic's point, and say, is this food good? Does it taste good? How is it? So those kind of dual things for me were really interesting from just a writer's standpoint. It was just kind of a lot of stuff to mine there, and my editor was very wary of it. She was worried I was just going to go and write this snobbish thing about how much chain food sucks, and I didn't want to do that either. There are things about Outback that are really terrible, but I found that kind of interesting to... the first conclusion I came to is, I have a real soft spot for fair food. I mean, and fair food is as American as food gets. I mean, that is the original kind of Americana. There really isn't fair food like that in the rest of the world, and it's a kind of unexplored territory, but really, again, rich. And so to go and have my first ever Bloomin' Onion, because I'd never had one before, and kind of have this epiphany like, this is a triumph of Americana is, I think, what I said it's true. I mean, it's the most perfect piece of fair food ever.
For those who don't know, what is a bloomin' onion? What's it made of?
It's an onion that has been cut the top off, but the bottom is left intact. And then, so it kind of blooms out like a flower. It looks like a flower, and then it is dipped in batter and deep fried. And so the layers, there being so many layers to an onion, it manages to kind of hold more grease than any other food stuff. And I don't remember exactly how much fat and calories there are in one of these things, but it is way more than your daily what you're supposed to eat in a day, and that's not even with the dipping sauce and stuff. So, but it's salty and greasy and pretty delicious. I mean, it's pretty delicious. and as soon as I started talking to people about it outside of work, just mentioning it to friends, it was like, people who you just would never expect, this kind of outpouring of like this secret, everyone has a secret love for the bloomin' onion. They love it, it's just perfect drunk food. It's perfect. It's in some ways perfect.
An appetizing start. This is Notebook on Cities and Culture. I'm Colin Marshall, coming to you from this warm day here in Silver Lake, recording out of doors today, with a food critic who's written in New York, who's written in Atlanta, and now since May of last year has written in Los Angeles for The Weekly. It's Besha Rodell, and she, of course, wrote that Bloomin' Onion article, but so much more. We're not going to focus on the Bloomin' Onion for the duration of this, but I have to ask you, what would be at an Australian restaurant that could make you, that could satisfy you, make you proud that it has the designation Australian? What's a non-fake Australian food?
There are actually some Australian cafes in New York now that are pretty close to, they're run by Australians. Australia has a really amazing cafe culture, mainly because the wave of Italian and Greek immigration that came to Australia was after the big wave of Italian and Greek immigration that came here. So we got a lot of post-World War I immigration, whereas most of the U.S. immigration was World War I and before that. And so one thing that happened was that the espresso machine had been invented by the time Italians started immigrating to Australia, which was not the case here. So Italians didn't bring espresso with them when they came to the U.S., but they did bring it to Australia. And so Australia has a 100-year-old, very European, vibrant cafe culture. And Melbourne in particular, which is the city that I'm from, Sydney too, but Melbourne in particular, Melbourne's the third biggest Greek city in the world, including Greece. So it goes Athens, Thessalonica, Melbourne. And there are lots of parts of Melbourne that kind of look like Europe. People sitting out on the street, drinking coffee, drinking wine. And so because of that, there's just this amazing kind of cafe culture. Australians have been eating that kind of fresh, European-influenced kind of food that America's only really got into in the last 10 to 15 years since I was a kid and probably before that. So it's funny. It's like people say, what do you get in an Australian cafe? Well, the one in New York and the ones in my hometown, you would get avocado on toast. That doesn't sound like that, much of a thing, but that's what everybody eats at home maybe. But I had a really interesting conversation with some people after that Outback thing came out, because some people were saying, well, what is Australian food? Why Australia doesn't really have a cuisine? And I actually got into a kind of thing with this guy who writes a column for Bon Appetit, because he said, I don't think Australia has a cuisine. But and I kind of came back and said, well, what's American cuisine? America has the cuisine of its immigrants. Pizza and bagels are not American inventions, and Australia is the same. So a lot of Italian and Greek influences, and more recently, a lot of Asian influences. But, it's also meat pies and we're mainly Brits. The white people there are mainly Brits or descended from Brits. So Sunday roasts, meat pies, shepherd's pies, that kind of stuff.
We talk about this question of what is real Australian food, and it ties into a larger Los Angeles thing, I think. You mentioned the Outback is an example of what is actively not Australian. There's nothing, nobody would say there's anything real about it except on its own terms. It is really the Outback Steakhouse. Right. But This question of authenticity, I mean, people throw that word around a lot here in Los Angeles. Do you think they do it more here than elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. I really do. I wrote about that when I first got here on our blog, actually, it's true of food culture everywhere, I think. But LA, more than anywhere else I've been, really seems obsessed with both, the best thing and that word authenticity. I'm pretty wary of that term. I don't like it. I understand where it comes from. I mean, for the same reasons that I am resentful of Outback Steakhouse, I can see why there would be a lot of people who'd be resentful of, bad imitations of Chinese food or Mexican food or whatever, and you want to have that thing that tastes like it came from a place of authenticity, but I do think that it gets taken too far, and I also think there's a lot to be. Culture evolves, and it's really interesting how it evolves, and yeah, Chinese food that tastes like you are eating in Sichuan province in China is fantastic, but American Chinese food has a 150-year-old history too, and that kind of snobbishness around this is not the real thing. I mean, Chinese immigrants came to America, they were working on the railroads with Americans and Italians. They were trying to figure out what kind of food they could cook that their co-workers and people that they were working alongside would like, and this is now a pretty grand tradition, but it is completely ignored and or derided by most people who consider themselves into food, and then it makes me furious because some hot new chef will be like, oh, I made General Tso's sweetbreads, and everybody freaks out because that's delicious, because General Tso's chicken is delicious,
So it's at every place for a reason.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. People like it, and again, that goes back to the thing of what do people really eat, and why do they eat those things? And some of them are horrifying, and some of them, whatever. Everybody has different tastes, but I think it's silly to write off any kind of, entire kind of cuisine or to put one way higher above another one. People have their preferences, but that question of authenticity, it really was not shocking, but really interesting to me when I first got to LA, how much people were kind of focused on that.
You can psychologize that too, right? It would be all too easy to say everybody in Los Angeles fixates on authenticity because there's so little of it surrounding them. You know what I mean? I mean, it's tempting to say that, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I can see that. I mean, LA is it's a lot of that. I mean, just the most obvious of it is, we just did this thing at LA Weekly on the arts side of things, where we did the greatest LA novel of all time, and I helped with that a bit and read a few of these books, and almost all of these novels that are known as these great LA novels are about all this sunshine and all the darkness that's underneath it, you know what I mean? And so I think that that's true for a lot of LA culture and stuff. I mean, I also think, to be honest, I mean, I really think that maybe not that obsession with authenticity, but that idea in the food world of going out and finding that real thing is driven a lot by how much of a influence Jonathan Gold has had on the food culture here, because that was for a long time and still is to a certain extent his real strength. And he's just such an important figure in American food writing, and LA can claim that. And it's a really different town than New York or Chicago in terms of food and what's great about it here. And a huge part of what's great about it here is, that you can drive out to these places and get this thing that you couldn't get anywhere else, or you could only get in LA except China or whatever. And, he brought a ton of attention to that. And that's one of the places where I think, that's one of the things that's great about LA and great about him and great about what he's done for the food world. But I do think that it spawned a lot of people who that was their entire goal in finding what to eat, was to kind of imitate his quest for these kind of places. And again, that's awesome and fun and one of the best things about LA. But I do think that feeds into that culture of looking for authenticity.
You mentioned Jonathan Gold, and he's written so much about Los Angeles food, but he's bounced around publication to publication, and he's written in New York as well. And people will say, he wrote, of course, before you did at the Weekly, and people will say, well, they hired you to be the opposite of Jonathan Gold. How much truth is there to that notion that they wanted someone as different as they could get from him?
I think there's a little truth to it. I think that they were looking for somebody who wasn't trying to be him more than they were looking for somebody who was the opposite of him. I think that they probably got a lot of applicants saying, I'm going to be the next Jonathan Gold.
Literally Jonathan Gold, too.
Yes. And I think that, if they found that person who really could do, but honestly, I think there's one Jonathan Gold, you know what I mean? And to try and imitate him would be really silly and I think a mistake for the Weekly, just because it would be there isn't going to be anybody probably out there who's better than him at what he does.
Being him, yeah,
at what he does. So yeah, that would just it would create even more of the impression that they had lost this kind of feather in their cap and couldn't quite replace it. And so I think they just tried to be like, well, we're not going to try and replace it, that you can't, and we're going to try and do something totally different. And from the very first conversations I had with the people at what was then Village Voice Media, the same company's changed its name, I just immediately kind of said, look, I have no interest in trying to be this guy, and I'm not going to write, these really long kind of very literary takes on travels through LA, in part because it would be false and it wouldn't, I didn't know anything about LA, so it would have been silly. And it's also just not what I'm good at. I really, really respect and admire people who are great at that. And, also I think, when Jonathan got his start, there was more time and space to be able to spend a lot of time figuring out these cultures and really immersing himself in them. And he has this reputation for spending a lot of time, literally translating menus, out of Korean and all that stuff. And I have always, since I started, been in this kind of crazy, insane blog cycle where I don't have as much time to do that. But I mean, it's just not my forte. I'm not as good at going and finding that tiny little gem out in the middle of nowhere. I can do it, but it's not what I'm great at. What I'm better at is, talking about a restaurant that has had a fair amount of buzz and telling people whether it's worth going there or not,
Clarifying the hype a bit, so saying, does this merit the attention it's been getting? Is that a central question for you? Is this worth what we've been hearing, as much as we've been hearing?
That's kind of a question. I think more of the question for me is what type of person would enjoy this and what type of person wouldn't, and trying to write in a way that will make that clear to both of those types of people. I mean, there's no doubt that my opinion comes into it a little bit, we're doing star ratings now, which the Weekly had never done in the past, and that's obviously too a big change, so yeah, there's definitely is this place as good as it, as people are saying? It's more for me too, what are they trying to achieve? Are they getting there? Different restaurants are trying to do different things, and so if it was all just about my taste and what I want to eat, that would not serve a city this big and very, very well. I feel like you should be able to tell that from reading me, but it shouldn't be the most important thing.
What's the difference between a restaurant that makes it easy for you to know who would enjoy it and one where it's a complicated question where you can't quite figure out who's going to be the type to enjoy this? What are the factors that confuse that question or make it clear?
It's pretty clear usually. I mean, I think that I don't want to... my personal taste is not the kind of glam, glitzy kind of Hollywood restaurant. That's not what I'm particularly interested in. But there are people who really like that, and and I understand that. And honestly, if I didn't do this for a living, I would like that a lot more. I mean, you want to go out and feel like it's entertaining as well as good. And so if somebody is doing that very, very well, and it feels like that buzzy kind of, it's awesome, and the food is also good, then I'm all for that. And I feel like, but it's, when I was in Atlanta, I reviewed this steakhouse by one of, Atlanta's kind of best known chefs, and we were on a 5-star rating scale, and I gave it 4 stars. It was very, very good. And I got an email from a reader saying, thank you for writing that review. Like, I read it and I just know that, like, I would hate this place. And so I felt like that was, a compliment, that, like, they could see through all the, the star rating and everything good that I said about the place, to know that, it was loud, it was full of businessmen drinking martinis. I mean, it did what it did incredibly well, but you want to give hints to people who aren't going to necessarily enjoy that. And I mean, I spend so much of my life in restaurants that I think it's pretty obvious to me, mostly from the time I walk in to, what kind of audience they're looking for, what kind of audience would appreciate it. I guess what makes it a little more difficult is, like, I'll use Outback as an example, which is Ludo and Vinny and John's new restaurant that is kind of difficult in a number of ways. It's very hard to get a seat. You have to pay for a ticket in advance. There is no telephone number. There's no sign outside. I mean, it's difficult. It's expensive. And you're basically at their mercy. You get what they give you. That's it.
Which is all its own kind of appeal in Los Angeles. It seems like there are plenty of people who like all of those things about it, I would guess.
Yeah, and I would count myself among those people.
Now, why are those all good?
I don't know if they're all good. It's just like, I really like it when chefs do kind of exactly what they want to do and aren't trying to placate anybody. I feel like we went through this long period in American restaurant culture where owners were very, very nervous about trying anything new, and so all of the restaurants were kind of similar, and you couldn't put anything kind of exotic on the menu, and you had to have a steak, and you had to have a chicken, and you had to have a flounder.
When did we come out of this period?
Very recently, I would say, in the last since 7 years, maybe 8 years. Wow. I mean, I think that it was starting in places like New York and LA 10 years ago, but so the change that I've seen of chefs kind of just really using it as a medium to kind of tell their own story and say, this is what I want to eat, and this is, I mean, you don't have to come if you don't want to, and the best restaurants, I feel like, are those restaurants who are cooking what they want to eat. And so, for Outback, it's like they have to be able to do that, to be able to do what they want to do there. It's really small. It's basically restaurant as theater. They don't have very many seats, and they want to present this 5-course thing to you. The pacing has to be very exact, and they don't want it to cost, $400 or whatever, which you would pay to go to some other restaurants that, are trying to create a kind of theater experience or whatever. So they can't really afford to have any empty seats. They just can't. I mean, it just economically would not work for them to do it on the scale that they're trying to do it. So then comes the ticketing system, which means that not only are they sure they've filled the seats, but they're sure that the people are going to show up. And if they don't show up, they still don't lose the money. And so that makes sense to me. I don't know. I like the kind of, like, it's hidden in a little pizza joint. I mean, it's just fun. I mean, it's whatever. They could have a sign. They could not have a sign. I think it's fun. It annoys some people a lot. And, the food is really exciting, but not pretentious. And it's weird. I've been talking a lot recently to people and some in reviews about kind of ego-driven food as opposed to devotional food. Like, I think that there's people who cook, they're like, went to Italy, learned how to make pasta. They've just devoted their life to making pasta. Coney and Ted's that just opened, it's a devotion to kind of the New England seafood of the chef's childhood. It's not. And then there's the other end of it, which is ego-driven food, which is like, this is my art, and it's all, incredibly creative. And I think both of those things really have a place. And Twamak fits in this really interesting in-between place where it's both of those things. It's not all, crazy foams and liquid nitrogen and stuff, but it's also not, it's not just a beautiful piece of fish cooked simply. I think that what I was getting to is that that is a little bit difficult to let people know if they would like it, because I liked it so much, and yet I understand that it was a little bit of a pain in the ass.
Well, at any restaurant, I don't care if I'm at a Denny's, I almost want to say, don't give me a choice. Give me whatever is best here.
Best.
Don't you want to do that at any given place?
Yeah, I think so.
Do you do that?
Yeah, I mean that's the point of a review is to say, well, it's the point of some reviews is to say, and again, how to make it so it's like this person would like this and this person wouldn't. It's like what dishes are you going to like if you are this type of person? What about this is good on this merit, and what about it is good for this other reason? If every restaurant just gave you exactly what they wanted to give you, I think there would be less of a market for restaurant criticism, because a lot of what I do is say, yes, go to this place, but get this, right. Don't get this other thing. And,
there's two levels there. Yeah. You're describing the place and then advising an action.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, that's not the case for Twamak. The Twamak, it's like, go or don't go. But yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I do think a lot of places it would be great to just say, just give me what's best. But then there's a lot of chefs that I don't trust with that, who maybe, they have...
Even good chefs.
Yeah, because they get very caught up in, like, the thing that they're really excited about, and sometimes that's great, and sometimes it's, like, a little overreaching, and they do something better. I mean, so many chefs have, like, such a weird relationship with their famous dishes, with the dishes that they become known for, because they can't get rid of them, but they're bored of them, and, all anybody ever wants to write about is that one thing, and... etc. But there's a reason why those dishes are so well received. They're delicious usually, and a lot of people who have come in didn't eat there over all of the months, and so.
What is a sign of a chef doing what we've talked about before, placating, doing too far the opposite of foisting upon you the dish they're excited about? What is the tell that the chef might not be asserting enough of themselves?
Right. Well, it depends on where you are. I think that right now in LA, I've been talking about this in the last couple of days with my editor a lot. It's hard because I have to make sure that I'm still writing for the regular diner and not becoming too jaded because I'm eating out all the time. But I am starting to get really frustrated with seeing so many similarities with so many restaurants around town. Everybody kind of doing the same kale salad and, handmade pasta with corn or whatever. It's like, it's everywhere. And
I've enjoyed a few of these kale salads, but at the same time, I don't want them everywhere.
They're everywhere. I mean,
they're at Echo Park Lake. Yes, they're everywhere.
They're everywhere. It's really crazy when something becomes that ubiquitous. And, I love burrata, but sometimes I feel like I'm going to shoot my face off if I see another burrata and fruit or whatever. And it's not that those things aren't good; they're delicious. But I do feel like, and some places are just trying to be a neighborhood restaurant, and they're trying to provide that kind of fresh, good California food to their neighborhood, and that's one thing. I think that there are some chefs who I can tell that they're so much more talented than just kind of doing these cliches or things that have recently become cliches. And I almost right now would prefer something that was interesting and a little odd and uneven than something that was perfect and derivative, So
perfection isn't that interesting,
right.
Ultimately,
yeah, exactly. And that's a big, that's a long time complaint of people about California cuisine in general. David Chang made the kind of figs on a plate joke, and that is a problem with California food. When I first got here, I was quite happy with that because it's not how people are cooking in the South right now, or even in New York. But after a year and a bit, I am starting to feel like I would like to see people be a little bit, just less run with the crowd. I mean, I think, a lot of times it's not chefs, it's owners that are really scared to, and you do see a big difference in chef-owned restaurants. I think that's where you start to see a little bit more experimentation, a little bit more taking risks. And it used to be, this is less and less the case, and probably has been less for California too, but purveyors used to play a really big part in that, and still do, I think, with wine. That when you're opening a restaurant, you get visited by many, many purveyors, both food and beverage, and most of them will, and this is like a story that never gets told. I would love to write about it, but it's kind of a really complicated story, but you get visited by all these purveyors, and they're talking to the owner. That's the person making the kind of financial decisions, and they'll say, oh, you're not going to have a burger? You have to have a burger. You're not going to have the, crappy Chardonnay that everybody will buy. You have to have that. That's how you keep that baseline of money coming in, and then you can do these other things on top of it, maybe. But I blame purveyors a lot for especially how boring a lot of the wine lists are in this town, and used to be, and I think still for a certain kind of neighborhood cafe that's relying more on U.S. Foods and Cisco to rather than the markets, which is dealing with farmers and just buying from the market is very difficult as a business owner. It's touted as this great thing, and it is a great thing, but it's harder. It's way harder. So if you're buying from these purveyors and they're, they have a lot of, you can get a great deal if you buy the thing that will sell a lot of, and, so it's a really complicated thing.
You mentioned before you came here, you didn't know anything about Los Angeles. What has been the process of, or what was the process of getting your head into the game here, getting a handle on Los Angeles, understanding it as best as you could before you had to come and hit the ground running?
Well, I basically had to come and hit the ground running. I was hired and moved here within 3 weeks. I mean, I did a lot of reading in that 3 weeks, obviously, but I was also trying to move and pack up my family and pack up this house that I had lived in for 6 years, and so I didn't have a lot of time to do as much research as I probably should have. I had always been a reader of Jonathan. I had always, the LA Times too, Irene, and so I had a bit of a grasp. And I think most restaurant critics who kind of take themselves seriously keep an eye on all of the kind of national players in the big important cities and know a little bit about what's going on through that. So, but I mean, LA is just so big. And like I said before, so much of what's interesting about it is the more daunting stuff that you kind of have to just have driven around here for years and years and years to really get an idea of. So, I mean, I'm not going to say that it was easy. It was really tough. I feel like I came and probably was in shock for about 3 months and just kind of stumbling around trying to get to the restaurants that I had to write about. And we had to do best. Well, I mean, this was a blessing and a curse. Best of came up very quickly when I got here. I've just turned in my best of blurbs for this year, so I got here in May of last year, so it was within a couple months. And so, I was all of a sudden, and they hadn't done things like best hamburger, best pizza, things like that in a long time. So I was kind of tasked with going out and figuring out these very basic things. And it was overwhelming, but it was probably really good. And then we very quickly went into the 99 Essential Restaurants, which doesn't come out until the end of winter, but we work on it for a really long time. And so that, again, was stressful but helpful to have to go out and eat at all of these restaurants, you know. And
what's the operating procedure there? Just like, you have to go to more than one a day. Did you have to go to more than one place a day? How many a day? How much were you eating? I mean, how did you control how much you had to eat to get an idea? Like, how did you tackle all this?
Yeah, it's really tough. I mean, at times of the year, like 99 Essentials coming up on our deadlines and best of, you often are eating multiple times a day. I mean, the process for 99 is pretty methodical. We write down all of the restaurants that might be worth considering, and that's a lot more than 99, obviously. We look at all the restaurants that had been on in the past. We look at all the restaurants that are new. We look for restaurants that may have been overlooked in the past that deserve that. And then we kind of whittle it down, and we go, you know, I didn't do it on my own. I think out of the 99, I wrote 50. So I did a lot, and I had help from our food editor, Amy Scattergood, wrote a lot, and a couple of other writers, freelance, and our food blogger. But, you know, and we all kind of took things that, you know, especially last year when I was new and I didn't know as much about a certain kind of food, you know. I mean, Amy, the food editor, is, you know, kind of really into noodles. So she's like, for this year, I'll take the noodles because, you know, so, you know, but it's tough. I mean, especially coming up towards the end, and I'm going to these restaurants that we kind of had all decided, yes, this has to be on there, and I would go and have a terrible meal and then say, you know, no way, I can't in good conscience put this, you know, so what are we going to put instead? And, you know...
How did you know whether you had a bad meal just then, or whether the rest that was representative of a slide in the restaurant's quality? Do you know what I mean? Like, was that a bad meal, or was it the bad meal that they are now consistently serving?
Right. I think for 99 is a little bit of a different standard than a regular restaurant review. And more of the problem for me is if I mean, and this is the thing that there's no way to tell and that is frustrating about it. If I had a bad meal, then it shouldn't be on that list. I just don't believe that it should be. I mean, these are restaurants...
to be stringent.
Yes. And these are restaurants that people are like checking off. We're saying, I mean, this is a huge city with, you know, probably 1,000 great restaurants.
They could go somewhere else.
Right. Yeah. And a lot of these places are, you know, kind of a long drive. Anywhere in LA is probably a long drive for somebody. So we don't want that to be the case. The more upsetting idea for me is that it's quite possible that I went somewhere and had a good meal when that's not representative. And that's kind of, it's funny when, you know, when I have those conversations with people about multiple visits for reviews and multiple visits for these types of things, which is somewhat of a dying thing. I think most, again, serious publications, you do multiple visits for a review, but you know, people say, well, if I had a bad meal somewhere, then, you know, then they deserve a bad mark anyway because they're still taking my money. And I'm like, yeah, that's fine, but if you had a good meal somewhere that was crap the next day, that's more of a problem, you know? So, I mean, you know, it's possible that for some of those restaurants, but they probably weren't going to be considered for the 99 unless they already had somewhat of a reputation for being a good restaurant, or unless I had already reviewed them or somebody had already reviewed them with those multiple visits, and you're kind of going back to say, is this still the standard that you know, I think it is, that it has the reputation for being. And if you go somewhere that has this reputation for being great and you just have a really disappointing experience, you know, the reader, some readers are going to have that too, and then they lose faith in you. So it's a bit of, it's not an exact science, but we do our best.
When you first got here, what struck you immediately? What hit hardest as far as how people eat here differently than they did in Atlanta or do in Atlanta or New York or anywhere else you've thought seriously about food?
Well, again, a lot. Well, in Atlanta, we have our great ethnic neighborhoods, fantastic Korean food. People will drive for that. People will drive for really good tacos. The sheer amount of that here is different. And, you know, I think that LA is just so big. People I think people tend to stay in their neighborhoods, whereas New York is much more compact in a lot of ways, and certainly in terms of kind of where the food is. And Atlanta is, it's a big city, but it's a really small city compared to LA. So people are willing to drive anywhere within the kind of center of that city to eat. Whereas here, I really think people want to know is it worth driving? Is it worth getting on the highway? I heard a lot of people when I first got here say, so I think a lot of our audience is on the West Side, and there's not a lot of food writing being written about the West Side, partly because the food there isn't as good as it is in other parts of
30
town.
years ago it was pretty great.
Yeah.
So I hear.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, it's kind of baffling to me. I don't get that. I mean, there's a lot of money in Santa Monica. I don't know why there's not better restaurants, but...
Yeah, I do. I mean, it is a really good question. It speaks to something about Los Angeles. I mean, you mentioned the distances. And this is something I struggle with writing about Los Angeles myself, not usually food, but... there's the Chinese food that Jonathan Gold celebrated in the San Gabriel Valley. You might go, even if you start downtown, you could go 18 miles east to get that. If you start in Santa Monica, you're like going 32 miles east or something like that. Yeah. When is it not Los Angeles anymore? That's the question I have for you.
It's interesting. I mean, and LA doesn't seem to have that prejudice. I mean, people are kind of okay with you writing about almost, I wrote about a buffet in Las Vegas. I mean, it was on the blog, but like people were really into that. Like that I wrote about the new buffet that opened in Las Vegas because people go to Las Vegas.
Flights are very cheap, LAX to Vegas.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's funny because in Atlanta is surrounded by a highway perimeter, and it's ITP or OTP, you're inside the perimeter or outside the perimeter. And every time I would write about a restaurant that was outside the perimeter, people get furious and really and there it's partly kind of like it's a southern issue. It's a kind of blue and red issue. People feel like Atlanta, the city, has been really neglected by the state. So there's a lot of emotions involved in there. People think you move out to the suburbs to buy a McMansion and be, and avoid the black people, basically. I mean, it's like Atlanta has a lot of those issues. So that's why people would say...
A different history than Los Angeles.
Yes, definitely. And so people would say, you need to support the real Atlanta and not be kind of promoting this crappy sprawl that policies and politics have kind of promoted. But I don't get that here at all. If anything, we get a lot of crap for not writing enough about the Valley, and really concentrating on. And, I'll cop to this. This is something that is true. I write mainly about downtown and the West Side and Hollywood because that's where most of the interesting restaurants are opening these days. Should I look farther? Yeah, probably. But again, I'm about to run out of my this is an excuse, my time for this is an excuse, but it's a huge city, and just kind of getting a handle on what is exciting going on in the city and what is really, the heartbeat of the food scene here. I feel like it's taken me a year just to figure that out in the small, big part of LA that I've already, really feel like I do have a handle on now. I don't have a handle on the Valley. That's kind of, that's one of my goals for the next year. And San Gabriel and places like that, and Bell and all of that to a lesser degree. I mean, I got out to a lot of those places for the 99 too, and so I know some of what's out there and what's worth checking out there. But it's going to take years,
Los Angeles is different from other major cities in that on the outside of the edge of the city, there's still interesting food. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily true of other places. But also, I mean, I live in Koreatown, like 3 subway stops, or a mile and a half from downtown. Mm-hmm. And if some judge said, legally, you can no longer eat anywhere else but in Koreatown, I'd actually be okay. I'd be like, oh, fine.
Yeah.
I don't know how those two things are compatible, really. I mean, within certain neighborhoods, you can eat for your whole life because there's that churn and there's so much. And in one like Koreatown, I happen to like Korean food. If you didn't, I could see it being a challenge. But both go on where it's like you have these food dense areas, but also interesting eating 20 miles from them.
Right.
It's double the challenge?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's totally double the challenge. And I think that, if I could have set up my life when I got here so that I lived in a different part of the city for 2 months for the first year that I was here, that would have been ideal. Because I don't think that there's any way to really get to know somewhere like Koreatown without living there, or, without going there once a week for 30 years, and it's very hard to go to every neighborhood like that's that interesting once a week for 30 years. It's, it's barely possible. So, I think that, like I said before, I think most regular people would like to stay in their neighborhood. And that's a huge part of my job, is just trying to give people that idea about it, how. And I think that that's where the star ratings come in and are a little bit helpful, because it's very hard to tell, I think, just from a straight essay, unless it is obviously positive or negative, obviously kind of really positive or negative. Okay, yes, I like this place. It's good. Is it worth that 30-minute drive? And I feel like in LA, that's really what those stars are for. Like, once you get into the 3-star category, that's when it's worth the drive. You know what I mean? That's at least how I think about it. And so it's hard, because I end up giving 2 stars to a lot of really great little restaurants. But I'm like, you've got that restaurant up the street from you. Why bother going all the way over there,
The late Roger Ebert, he said much about how he didn't like the thumbs up, thumbs down system he had to use on television, but he didn't like the star ratings either. He had to give out in the paper. And I wonder, you mentioned star ratings, you mentioned the weekly going to star ratings, and that seems like a valid use, the sort of, does it merit the drive, as that test of how you personally use the star ratings. But do you have any frustrations with the star system?
Yeah.
I mean, even if somebody tells me I should review something like just on Yelp or whatever,
right.
I just give everything 3 stars and then write whatever I want. Is it ever tempting to just do that, slap 3 on it all, and write about it?
I've been with a star rating system my whole career until I came to the weekly, and as soon as I got there, I really pushed for it. I really thought that it was important, mainly because the Times had just given it up. If they were still doing it, I would have felt like it was less important. And, immediately regretted having pushed for it as soon as I had to start giving them. And I don't mean that kind of seriously, like that's a personal thing. I personally don't like having to do it. It's a pain. It doesn't allow me to think about restaurants in the way that I might prefer to think about them. But I also really understand how not important, but how useful they are for customers, especially in the age of Yelp, when everything on Yelp has 4 stars, pretty much. It's like you can't.
And that's because there's 5 star, 1 star, 5 star, 5 star, 5 star, 1 star.
Exactly, and so. And yeah, people on Yelp don't rate with that in mind. If they like it, it gets 5 stars. If they had a crap experience, it gets 1 star. That's basically how it works. And there's exceptions to that and whatever. But I think that it's just really, it's not fun for me, but it's not about me, that's what it comes down to, is like, it was much easier before I was giving out stars, and I'm glad that I didn't have to as soon as I came, because I had nothing to measure against, and it would have been bogus, I think. I think 6 months in, I started to get a feel for like, what is the best of the best in this city, and what do people want to drive for, and what are the chefs in this town trying to achieve, and how well are they doing that, and it's not my least favorite part of the process is figuring out the rating. Usually it's obvious what it is from the first meal, but people hate them, they love them. I kind of try to say, if you don't like them, ignore them. You should be able to tell from the review. Yes, you should be able to tell from the review, but it's just, and I do think it's helpful. Not helpful, that sounds like I'm more important than I am, but I was going to say to the chefs, part of why I started talking to the Weekly about it, and I wrote an essay when we started the star system that talked about this, but when I was out here for my interview, I was sitting in a restaurant with Amy, the food editor, and one of the chefs in town, one of kind of LA's better known chefs. I'm not going to name him in case everybody is mad at him for being the impetus for this, but came up and was talking to her, and didn't didn't, know who I was and didn't care, but was talking about how the LA Times had just given up their rating system and really was saying, I think that when you're a chef and you're opening a restaurant, especially on this certain level, like you're aiming for a certain level and you want to know if you're getting to that. And, there are chefs out there who probably don't trust me to be making that call anyway. But I think for chefs for who that is important, it's a service to them to say, is this just like, yeah, this is good, which is like the 2-star rating, or is it really pretty awesome, which is the 3-star?
They want their score.
Yeah, they want their score, and they want to know how well what they're doing is translating. And, there was a lot of disappointment when Michelin left LA, and I just think it's too important of a town, nationally and internationally, to not have anybody rating. It's in some ways a bogus premise, the star rating system. I get it, but I also think it's helpful for chefs, it's helpful for consumers, it's very helpful for travelers to kind of say, okay, what do I have to get to while I'm in LA? And I could be wrong, but there's also not very many other ways to know that. If on Yelp every single, taco stand in town has, 4 stars.
We bring up the whole Yelp thing, and it's a conversation that's gone on at some volume.
Yeah.
What does Yelping take over the function of restaurant reviews, or are they two different things? Or do restaurant reviews show you how bad Yelp reviews are? There's all these opinions, and for me, a Yelp review and a review I would read in the weekly, whether by you or Jonathan Gold, is I realize now they're completely different things, and I use them in different ways. Does the existence of the Yelps of the world take away some of the functions that you never wanted to do in the first place, writing about restaurants?
That's interesting. Yeah, probably. I mean, I think that it certainly is a great crowdsourcing device for just finding out what's out there and what's opening. And, a lot of the places that I'm interested in that are opening are not going to be sending out press releases, and, that old school, again, kind of, just driving the streets, and again in a city that is what, like, how 33,000 square miles or whatever it is, like
500.
Yeah. Oh,
it feels like it might as well be 33,000 square miles.
I think that is harder to do, almost impossible to do, and again with the kind of blog schedule that we have, I just don't have time for. So it's a really good resource to say, oh, that looks interesting, like somebody's writing about that. I don't take too many of the reviews super seriously or pay that much of attention to the star rating of a restaurant or whatever, but I also feel like it's adding to the conversation. It's a democratization, and I don't have any problem with it at all. I understand why chefs are frustrated with Yelp. I really do. But every business now is under that same constraint. The internet's there, and people are going to talk about them on the internet, and it's just a reality. So the interest in food in the last 10 years has just obviously exploded. It's outrageous. I am constantly baffled that I managed to fall into something that became so big.
Do you think it's internet-driven, the fact that people can share so much about food now?
It might be, yeah. I think it's, there's been a lot of conversation about that too. It's a natural kind of furthering of people being more concerned about where their food comes from. It's an offshoot of kind of the hipster culture that's arisen over the... But it's not just those things. It's not like there's a lot more interest in art than there was 10 years ago. That's still a fairly niche kind of thing, There's not a ton more interest in... You could take anything and say, well, since food has kind of blown up in this way, why hasn't science? You know what I mean? And I don't know all the reasons for it. I interviewed Nigella Lawson a couple of months ago, and she was like, well, people say there's too much food on TV and there's too much food everywhere, but, like, why is it any less important than sports? And I was like, oh, that's interesting, that I can't answer that. I mean, I know for myself why I became so interested in it, but I don't know why it doesn't translate that well to the internet. You can't eat through the internet, you know what I mean? Whereas you can look at art through the internet, you know?
Growing up, how did you get interested in restaurant culture? And when you started reading about food, who were you reading?
Well, I got interested in restaurant culture from working in restaurants. I was living in North Carolina, mainly because my mom was living there at the time when I was in my early 20s, and just kind of, you know, bumming around, and I worked for a kind of natural grocery store that got gobbled up by Whole Foods, and kind of went from that to working in restaurants, and very quickly kind of fell in love with the camaraderie, and I was lucky enough to be in a restaurant and be hired by somebody who was really knowledgeable about wine, and got together with the person who's now my husband, who was cooking at that restaurant at the time, and you know, really very immersed in that kind of line cook culture. And we moved to New York so that I could go to college, and he got a job at one of the really great restaurants in New York, and I continued to, I had been front of the house and back of the house in North Carolina. I had kind of gone to the back of the house, and then when we moved to New York, you know, we couldn't really afford to both be cooks, so I went back to waiting tables. But just really, I was working at this restaurant in Brooklyn, and this was kind of on the precipice of Brooklyn becoming what it is. It wasn't quite that at the time, but in a really small restaurant where the interaction with customers and the kind of almost the education component, talking to them about wines that weren't that popular at the time, and food that wasn't what it is now. I just really enjoyed that conversation. I just really loved that kind of constant thinking about it and talking about it that you get to do if you work in a restaurant. And went to school for writing and literature, and was working in publishing, was working for literary agencies, and kept going back to waiting tables even though I didn't really need to anymore because I really missed it. So
kept your hand in the world of restaurants.
Mm-hmm. And I really love food, and it's part of my constant conversation within my family every day, and has always been since I was a kid. I mean, I talk to my mom or my uncle or my brother on the phone, and it's like, what are you eating? What are you drinking? That's my family conversation. And I come from a family of very good home cooks, and so I've always been into it, but it was really the restaurant culture that kind of bit me. And that's one of the toughest things about my job now, is that I kind of have to be removed from that, and those people are the people who are my natural social circle, I think. I like cooks even more than chefs. Like I like line cooks. Like I like that.
An important distinction to make is that you have chefs and cooks.
Yeah, I mean, and cooks become chefs, and I still like them once they're chefs. But it's that kind of. I think it's kind of this mix of this very blue collar profession that you have to be really, really invested in, all in. You cannot. And I don't think that that's
Nobody's
true.
kind of a cook.
Nobody's kind of a cook. And if you are, you very quickly are not a cook anymore. And I don't think that that's true of a lot of other kind of trades. You're not obsessed with plumbing, or I don't know, but I don't think so. And there's not that same kind of camaraderie. And
there's a lot of kind of writers floating around,
yes,
that's for sure.
Yes, there are a lot of kind of writers. But I mean, I think that you have to be that person who's like obsessing about ingredients and obsessing about food culture and obsessing about the best way to do things. So you have to be kind of a nerd, and you have to be smart, and you have to, be that person. Otherwise, you're not going to make it. So I like that mix. I like that kind of mix of people who are filthy-mouthed and filthy-minded a lot of times, and also really, really nerdy about and passionate about what they do. So, yeah, I mean, that's what sucked me in. And then basically what happened was I got pregnant, and I moved back to North Carolina to have a baby, and was kind of miserable there. And because I just had been living in New York and had this, been in the literary world, and so I had a contact with the local Out Weekly editor through some people that I knew, and eventually kind of convinced them to let me write a restaurant column. So I mean, it was really a way for me to say, okay, how am I going to put these two things together? How am I going to put the part of me that's still obsessed with food? And, it was funny, right before I got pregnant, I had been sitting in a cafe, and there was this young woman who came up to the table and was waiting tables and was pregnant, and I was like, I'm going to stop waiting tables when I wasn't thinking about getting pregnant at the time, but I was like, I don't want to be a pregnant waitress, that's when it's going to be time to move on. And so I was like, well, I'm not done with food, but I don't want to be working, some people are really great restaurant professionals their whole life, but I was too into the kind of literary writing world, and I wanted to do that too. So for me, it was a way to figure out how to do both of those things.
So many conversations I have with friends about how to understand Los Angeles, whether they come from the world of food or writing or wherever, they always say you really can't understand Los Angeles unless you do a lot of eating, a wide variety of eating here. And I would assume you agree with that, but what would you say to someone who tries to understand, or who comes here and tries to understand Los Angeles by eating in it?
Well, I guess it depends on what they're trying to get out of it, I mean, it's funny. I interviewed the New York chef Eddie Huang a couple of months ago, and we were talking about that kind of problem with understanding LA from the outsider's perspective, and and I was kind of saying to him, like, because he's very, as many people are, he's kind of wary of LA. He doesn't get it. He comes here and he doesn't get it. And I was saying, people outside of LA, they know these things about LA. They know that there's Hollywood here. They know, a lot of people of, my generation grew up knowing it as like this hip hop rap mecca. And so they know that there's Long Beach and Compton, right? And then people who are interested in food know Jonathan and know that there's this great kind of world of Chinese and Korean and Japanese food here, and tacos. But those three things, as much as they're obviously huge and important, they're not how most people here live, I think. And so it's hard for people who come here who don't get LA and have, to kind of understand why you would like living here, or understand what the people who actually live here really get out of it, And so
what's actually going on in the main.
Right, exactly. And again,
except we can speak of a main in Los Angeles.
Right. And even people who I have my husband has a friend who's a cook who cooks in this restaurant in New York, and he's one of these line cooks, and he came here to do a dinner last week, and went out and ended up at like the Rainbow in Hollywood. I mean, and that's what he's going to think of LA as, because that's what people come here and that's what they see. So, and there's an aspect to that, like, okay, maybe you need to see that. I don't know if you need to see that. Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But, I mean, it really depends on what you want to get out of it. I would say you really need to get into the neighborhoods and eat the way that different neighborhoods are eating, and to do that, you have to maybe go to the neighborhoods where, I don't know. I think it depends on what you want to get out of it. But there's a lot, there's a lot in Boyle Heights. There's a lot in Koreatown. There's a lot of places that aren't Silver Lake, that you need to get to.
Indeed, to get outside of Silver Lake, but it's Silver Lake, Silver Lake's enjoyable, and it's where we've been talking. And by the way, I've been speaking here with food writer, food critic, restaurant critic. What do you like to go by as a job title?
Restaurant critic is my formal title, yeah.
You are critiquing the restaurant. It's not, food critic is a little misleading, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And actually, I think my business card does say food critic, but I prefer restaurant critic because, I'm not... I do a lot of writing outside of restaurant criticism, too, for the paper, and that's not critical writing. I mean, it's just kind of reporting. So,
writer and restaurant critic, Besha Rodell. Besha, thanks so much for taking the time today.
Yeah, thanks. It's been great.
This has been Notebook on Cities and Culture. I've been Colin Marshall. You can keep up with the cultural creators, internationalists, and observers of the urban scene on the show at colinmarshall.org. Thanks. Special thanks to everyone who backed Season 4 on Kickstarter, including Joel Neville Anderson, Daniel Levin Becker, Paige Calvert, Commander Manvark, Jonathan Crow, John Cunningham, David Dawes, James DeVito, Tim Dobbs, Paul Doyle, Jake Elliott, Kevin Emmett, Lawrence English, Jonathan Filbert, Andrew Philippone Jr., Michael Fransky, John French, Themistocles Eucrucius, Will Graham, Umberto Grant, Samuel Hansen, David Hayes, Jeff Hillenbrand, Mark Hines, Andrew Johnstone, Tadeusz Andrzej Kadlubowski, Peter Kavanagh, Ted Kane, Andy Cooney, Evan Landman, Alfred Lee, James Maloney, Sean McDonald, Alberto Bruzos Moro, Jason Miller, Rob Montz, Daniel Murphy, Richard Nash, Aidan Nullman, Patrick O'Flaherty, Danny Olson, Michael O'Regan, Ian Blosker, Christopher Porter, MJ Pritchett, Piers Rippey, Rob Schultz, Todd Shimoda, Cam Smith, Deborah Smith, Adam Sutherland, Maureen Kincaid Speller, Anna Traher, Thomas Interberger, Matt Warren, Nick Weigelt, Dion Wolf, Cynthia Yang, and Wayne Wright.